Okay, invite up our next speaker. John Goodfellow is recognized as a leading authority on utility vegetation management and reliability. He currently manages an active portfolio of vegetation management-related research projects, focusing on electrical characteristics of tree conductor contacts, tree biomechanics, and integrated vegetation management practices. John worked to create the Right-of-Way Steward Accreditation Program, focusing on IVM in the North America High Voltage Power Grid, and leads the Technical Advisory Committee. Welcome, John.
Thanks, Iris. Well, I'm really pleased to be here. Iris has invited me a couple times, and just due to scheduling conflicts, I've been unable to attend. But what I want to tell you about is a project that I just completed with Drs. Nowak and Wagner at SUNY ESF, Environmental Science and Forestry at Syracuse, where we looked at a very pragmatic and hard-nosed approach, perhaps, looking at the cost of integrated vegetation management, as opposed to a program that really did not consider anything but repeated mowing. So why did they undertake the project? I should say, obvious question, what is CEATI? So it's a Canadian entity, Center for Energy Advancement Through Innovation, based in Montreal, and they are active in the utility space, and they have a vegetation management working group. So why did they undertake the project? Well, first, there is no doubt that reliability is a major driver. So you see the data here. In fact, I didn't upgrade this table, but we had an aberration in the years. In 2015, there were 3 events, and now we're back to about 1. To put this in context, there are probably about 10 million acres of transmission corridor in North America. So that's 1 tree fault per million acres. It's a pretty low incident rate, but when they happen, it's a big deal. And this is not trees falling in from outside the corridor. But there is basically a big concern over vegetation creating a conflict. There's also a lot of money being spent, right? And there are regulatory implications. So the vegetation management budgets are typically the largest O&M, operations and maintenance budgets, expenditures that a utility has. And there are regulatory fines, at least on the high voltage grid, that can go to hundreds of thousands and millions of dollars. And that's usually the cheap part of a citation, because you also have to implement a number of things. The ratio of fine to total cost is about 5 to 1. So it's a very significant regulatory issue as well. And the other reason why this project was undertaken is because there is concern that the use of herbicides may be at risk. And without understanding the cost consequences of that loss, it's easier for decision makers to acquiesce to the idea that we don't need to use herbicides at all. So there were really those 3 drivers, right? So there's reliability, cost, and public perception and the potential loss of herbicides. And I will tell you this, you really can't do, this may be a controversial statement for some folks, but I do believe you really cannot effectively implement an integrated vegetation management program without inclusion, not exclusive use, but without inclusion of herbicides. So we set up the study to compare 2 strategies. Now I'll tell you that the IVM strategy is all about the I, integrated. So it's a practice that includes a wide range of treatments, as opposed to simply controlling trees. So really, you think about those words. We're managing cover types versus controlling incompatible plants. And I will also tell you that there are 3 references that really codify integrated vegetation management. The first one is ANSI A300 Part 7. The ANSI A300 series is what arborists and utility foresters rely on. There are 3 relevant, really particularly relevant sections within that. There's part 1 is pruning, Part 7 is integrated vegetation management, and Part 9 is tree risk assessment. So the thing that I want to leave you with on ANSI is to be looking for, probably in the next 6 weeks, an opportunity to provide feedback on the latest draft of that document. So it's in its revision, version 3. current one is 2012. Version 3 is significantly revised to really line up well with integrated pest management principles and the other important guidance, and that is the right-of-way stewardship accreditation requirements, which codify IVM. In between the ANSI standard and Roche Steward, accreditation is a best management practice that will be written once A300 is done. But A300 is up for revision. There will be a public comment period, so be looking for that if you want to have input on what the IVM standard looks like. Back to the point of this slide, an integrated approach or simply repeatedly mowing. So the project involved an extensive literature review. We looked at everything we could find, and we winnowed the list down from over 100 to about 50 articles that had relevance. And I'm going to give you some highlights of what we found. But essentially, some of this is pretty obvious, but the point of these bullets is to say there are data behind them. That the change in density is clearly due to the ability of IVM techniques to eliminate incompatible trees. There's terms I want you to, I'm going to use that you need to have your head around. Within the context of IVM are the ideas of compatible and incompatible vegetation, and it has to do with the intended use of the site. One of the changes we're making in the new standard is to eliminate the bias to electric transmission. So it will include pipeline corridors and highway corridors, or perhaps if you were managing particularly large blocks of land for wildlife. If you had an interest in early successional plant communities, then this standard would apply. Beyond the herbicide applications, we also know that the mechanical treatments, particularly mowing, but hand cutting and mowing, can be effective, and that there's this obvious response to both of those treatments. With the herbicides, you end up with the plant community response absent of the incompatibles that were present, unless they were too small to see or they were present as seed. With the mechanical or hand cutting without herbicides, you have the same plant and it's regrowing with a vegetative response. One of the things we found is the literature really doesn't understand how the practitioners use practice IVM. So almost all of the studies we found were focused exclusively on what we call density, numbers of stems per unit area. When we talked to the practitioners, they said, well, we think of that more volumetrically. So we developed a stocking table, and this is really similar to what forestry uses. It talks about the occupancy of the site. And this is basically one of the things I'm most, I guess, proud of from this project is we finally figured out how to express density and height in terms of stocking, and it allows us to go forward with management prescriptions. So again, the literature talks about stems per unit area. Practitioners throw in the third dimension. Some other things that came from the literature, surprisingly to me actually, is that most cover types that would be compatible with transmission line are quite comparable in their ability to suppress incompatible plants. So they're using competition, and they're making habitat available for critters that would either eat seeds or browse seedlings. We also think that the difference that you see in cover types as they evolve over time, I'm talking about the difference between herbaceous cover versus woody cover that would be compatible, is mostly a function of time. So the reason that the shrub communities might be more effective in suppressing trees is because they have longer time within a concept of succession, occupying the site than herbs, forbs, grasses. So that was kind of interesting. It means really that if in the context of IVM, if you were on any sort of periodic treatment, I hesitate to call it a cycle, but if you were on a periodic treatment, usually the difference between the herbaceous and woody cover types is immaterial because you're not running it long enough for the non-woody types to start to be invaded at a different rate. And I'll let you read these things. I'm going to read them directly to you. The other thing that we learned is that even under what we think is a fully occupied site, there's openings. And that's how the incompatibles, in this case, again, the tall-growing trees, become established. So, and you think about a right-of-way. It's surrounded by, if it's surrounded by cover types that contain incompatible species, then there's always recruitment into the managed area. It's just how succession works. Some other things that we learned, and if you look at those first 4 bullets, they're like pairs. We're looking at selective chemistry and selective applications. So selective chemistry, to most of woody plant managers, means growth regulator-based herbicides that work on dicots or broadleaf plants and do not work on grasses and sedges. So what we see, not surprisingly, is if we're using selective chemistry, we create more herbaceous cover, particularly monocots. If we're using non-selective chemistry, everything is being affected. If we look at the delivery systems, selective versus non-selective applications, non-selective create more grasses and forbs, whereas selective, you can select more effectively to retain covers that are appropriate, that are compatible, such as shrub communities, if we're not talking about a transmission line. Mowing tends to produce woody shrubs and trees because of the vegetative regrowth response. And the amount of disturbance varies with treatment, but what we found too is that we're not able to sustain this last bullet. This is something I always thought was true. We believe you get a richer cover, a mosaic, a variety of covers with IVM, but there's no literature that supports that. So that's an opportunity for any researcher. So Iris reminded me this is a habitat thing. So let me connect some dots for you. Why is this important to habitat? Why is IVM important? Well, wildlife managers will tell you that among the tools they have, and certainly they have regulations for, like bag limits and things like that, but one of their most important tools in the way they manage wildlife is to manage cover. You create the opportunities and the animals do their thing. So on a transmission line and in any other long linear habitat, you by definition have a lot of edge. In wildlife, what I learned in college is wildlife's a function of the habitat, the quality of habitat, which means what? It means that they need to have a variety, and they're talking about nesting, resting, and feeding and breeding covers, intermixed and juxtaposed with each other. So it's the mixing and how close the pieces come together. And one of the things that the right-of-way does is it gives you a lot of edge, a lot of transitional habitats. So that's why I think wildlife equals habitat, and habitat is managed by IVM effectively. The other thing you have to really accept is that the benefits or not of these covers and these corridors in particular really depends on the species. So if you're Andre's spider having a hard time getting across the ceiling, a right-of-way can result in a very significant barrier by fragmenting habitat. On the other hand, if you are a songbird in North America, in northeastern North America, that has, shouldn't say historically, because way back the whole eastern part of the continent was continuous forest, but all of these open meadow species that for now 100 years have benefited by the openings are being feeling some pressure, essentially, as those old fields revert to forest. And these openings that are created by a pipeline right-of-way or a highway right-of-way or a transmission right-of-way are really important to those kinds of animals. And then and right-of-ways can also create transit corridors. So it really depends on the critter, and it depends on the characteristics of the corridor. So we did a survey. I won't leave this slide up very long, but to give you an idea, we looked at all of these different kinds of treatments and all sorts of different kind of chemistries, delivery systems, and we compared An IVM strategy that would use them all, I want to be really clear, the IVM strategy uses both herbicide-based and non-herbicide treatments versus a strategy that only looked at mechanical cutting and hand cutting. So one of the things that we learned quickly is when you approach this project like this, you really need to think about the economic model you're going to use. And this was fundamental to how we proceeded. Least cost analysis basically says you look at the direct costs that are quantifiable and they can be monetized. If you start to want to consider benefits, then you can bring them in and you can actually quantify them. Sometimes you state them qualitatively, but you can quantify them, and that's a cost of effectiveness analysis. So your benefit stream may not have dollars associated, but you can present and model changes characterizing the benefits. The holy grail would be a cost-benefit analysis where the benefits are monetized. And you know, I don't know that that's going to be a very easy thing to do. In this particular project, CEATI restricted us to only consideration of those direct costs. So this was a pragmatic, hard-nosed, accountant-like assessment. And I can tell you that I'm a tree hugger at heart, shall we say, and what I've learned is that working within the system is a way to affect change really efficiently. So my whole motivation here is to speak to the budget director, the head of the finance, or whoever, and not talk about the value-added externalities, but to simply talk in terms of how does this affect your bottom line. Very pragmatic. We'll talk about benefits near the end, but I want you to know we're really looking at just the bottom line kinds of costs in this particular project. So how did we have to do this? Well, we used the literature to develop some production functions. And to economists, production functions basically talk about what inputs there are and what results you get over time. And so we had to build a production function for the changes in the density of, and stocking, because we bring a height component in here in a minute, of incompatible plants over time under the 2 scenario. And we had about 17, I think, studies that allowed us to build the production function on density. And so we have a curve for IVM, which includes the herbicides and other methodology, and we have a curve for the non-IVM, shall we call it. And let's see if I can go backwards quickly. If you see those green bars, let's go back here quick to there. So if you look at, I want you to notice under density those labels, ultra light to heavy, and how many stems per unit area that represents. So if we go back here, oops, you can see that even under the when you reach a situation with the non-IVM strategy, that you don't get below the medium to light categories. And with the IVM strategy, you get down into that very low and ultra low. That's a very, very big difference in terms of the cost consequences over time of managing the corridor. So from that, we were able to say, okay, there are two phases. There's a phase where you're really converting the site, and then there's a phase where you're maintaining the site. Under maintenance, you continue to see change, but it isn't nearly as dramatic as it occurs in that first time period. Now, we're using 10 years. Most of the transmission systems are managed on a 4 or 5, sometimes 3, sometimes 6 or 7 year basis, but we used 5. If you were in a different ecotome, you might shorten that scale or you might extend it, but the shapes of those curves are what's important, because you'll see how we use those in a minute. The other thing that we learned from the literature is there was very little that talks about the regrowth response in terms of height. Remember I said that density was something that typically were addressed in the articles. So we had some challenges to develop our height yield curve, but to get to stocking we needed this. So what you see are what we ended up with that we can defend based on the published literature, but I can tell you that I suspect there's nuance that needs to be reflected in these curves. So the blue line is the IVM curve. Why doesn't it start at 0? because you assume that you are treating the stems you can see, but there are seedlings on the site that are buried in the compatible cover, and they will emerge. You'll miss them when you do your first treatment. And the mechanical mowing curve assumes that you got cutting right down close to the soil surface, so that's why that starts like that. The nuance that I think needs to be reflected here is I think the red line needs to have a bow in it. So we know that there's an exaggerated growth response. Some of the articles talked about it generally, so I would say that it increases more rapidly in the first 1 or 2 or 3 years, height growth, and then it'll probably parallel the curve for IVM. So it'll be that kind of shape. Probably get us to about the same place out about 20 years, but there's work that needs to be done on the height growth response to make this model even better, if you will. We ended up developing a matrix, family of matrices like this. This is an example. Those are dollars. I'm not going to tell you if those are US or Canadian dollars or acres or hectares. The point is that we have dollars for each combination, each treatment based on the stocking, and we color-coded the cells. So the red cells are, you probably aren't going to do this, or you can't do it, and the green cells are the sweet spot, and the yellows are sort of in between. So we have one of those for every treatment, including the mechanical and the hand cutting. So then we're moving into the economic analysis. So we're bringing all this into a present value of cost analysis. We looked at different treatment intervals, 3, 4, and 5 years, and we know that those things will vary depending on the ecosystem or even the company or perhaps the regulatory environment. So some regulatory commissions mandate intervals of treatment. And we use a 20-year horizon. We picked 20 because actually it allowed us to work with 4 and 5 year cycles. There's nothing magical about it. And then we did some sensitivity analysis. So we started with a very wide range of discount factors, and we brought them down. And the literature actually helped us. We saw the few economic studies that are out there published, discount rates of between 4 and 8%. And we felt like at the end, 5% was a good one to use. So, and we also did a quick little analysis on whether or not nominal or real pricing should be used. So real pricing versus nominal is constant dollars or dollars discounted because of inflation. And we found out that constant dollars work pretty well. There's actually some forestry data on pre-commercial thinning that allowed us to do that analysis. Okay, so that's how we built the model, how we built the algorithms. Now here are the case studies we're going to test. The first one is to say, let's just do a head-to-head comparison of IVM versus non-IVM methodology over the life of a project, the 20-year life of a project. So we did not include the cost of initial establishment, the clearing, but the time horizons ran from there out. And then that's pretty much what everybody thought we should do. And then we added a couple variants to that. We added a reclamation scenario. So this is a scenario where the vegetation management or maintenance work has been deferred or ignored, and the corridor has been largely unmanaged and is out of control. And the third one is that possibility that what happens if you have a really well-established IVM-based management system on a right-of-way. In other words, it's dominated by compatible plants. What happens if you lose the ability to continue the use of herbicides? So let's look at them. So the base case, here's an example of what we did. Now these models allow us now, we can substitute, we can write any prescription we want under the IVM scenario. So what I did here is following initial clearing, we did a broadcast foliar application. Then we went in with an increasingly selective foliar. And then we went to low volume foliar. So what you see is as the incompatible component drops, we can be less and less disruptive to the ecosystem. Under the mowing scenario, we just mowed and mowed and mowed and mowed. So the survey says, there's a column on the far right here. The way to think about this is how cheap would the mowing scenario have to be, present value discount back to the common dollars, before it matched the economic efficiency least cost of the IVM strategy. That's what that far right column says. But the IVM savings column is where everybody's mind goes first. Basically, you're seeing that the savings is about 50% or in that range. So let me explain the 75 minus and the 75 plus. What we said was, okay, we think our production function curves are correct, but what if we're wrong? What if we're 75% less efficacious? Meaning that there is we're going to move those curves up to have 75% more stocking on the right-of-way at the time that each maintenance practice goes. And conversely, what happens if we are so conservative that in fact the both mowing and the IVM strategy works better, 75% more effective? What does that look like? And so what you see is it doesn't change the relationships that much. I'm going to show you something a little more interesting. So then we said, all right, these look so compelling. These savings look so substantial. Do we believe them? So then we set up a really hard test. We said, let's look at two scenarios. IVM at the standard production curve versus let's assume that the mechanical method was actually 75% more effective. Conversely, we said, let's assume that the IVM strategy is less effective, and that the IVM and the non-IVM strategy is as effective as we predicted. So it's those pairs. And what you see is that under the top scenario, where we basically said the mechanical methodology was 75% more effective in stocking, that it actually gets you into a savings. It's cheaper. It's 8% cheaper. That's what that minus 8% means. So if you're at 70 or maybe 2/3 less effective, you get on parity. You get parity. Excuse me. And under the other scenario, where the IVM strategy wasn't as effective as you thought, but the mowing was, you're still beating the mowing substantially. You know, nearly 40%. So those kinds of, we picked those 75 bands not based on our confidence intervals, but based on the fact that we wanted to bracket based on the literature. We knew what the studies looked like when we built the production functions, and we said, okay, this is probably the bandwidth of those things. Okay, so here's how we're using the conversion phase versus the maintenance phase. This scenario basically says you got it right away. You haven't done anything to it but mow it. It's out of control, and you're going to now reclaim it. So the dotted line says you're going to continue to simply mow it, and the solid line says we're going to implement an IVM strategy to convert the cover. And those are the prescriptions there. You can see where we're using, again, on the bottom line, repeated mowing versus increasingly selective IVM methods. So what does it say? So if we're going to reclaim the right-of-way, the first line is basically how do I say this? So there's three versions of reclamation. Two of them start with mowing, and then you follow up with an herbicide treatment. The third one is you don't even bother mowing it, you aerial spray it. Now I tell you that there's not a lot of aerial applications going on, but one of the funders of the project does use aerial applications. So what you see here is the two herbicide-based conversions, and I should go back. I'm not sure I'm being really clear on that. So if you look at year zero, so this is mow and cut stubble. Cut stubble is you treat immediately following mowing. You don't have to have foliage. It's a soil-active herbicide. The other scenario would be a broadcast letting the stems resprout, and you treat them 1 or 2 growing seasons later. The third scenario in year 0 would be basically aerial application. And you can see here we are down in that 30% savings range again over continuing mowing. And the reason there's no break-even discount on the aerial application is it's cheaper than mowing to start with. So you never get to a crossover point. Okay, loss of herbicides. So this one is where you have established an IVM-based program. So we're not looking at the conversions phase. We're going to start our model at the point where you think you've gotten relatively steady state conditions. And you lose herbicides, and you get you start mowing where you hadn't been mowing. And those stems that are incompatible that are still there will resprout, and the disturbance created by the mowing head creates the seed bed for incompatible trees, and so you quickly get to a place that is essentially on the production curve for mechanical treatments, as if there was no IVM practiced at all on the site. And the cost breakdown there is again, the reason that the discount rate can't be calculated is you can't ever get to that point. So you'd end up doubling your cost on this 20-year scenario if you lose the herbicides. So in every case, every one of those scenarios, the use of herbicides in IVM demonstrated very substantial savings. And I want to be really clear again. I'm only looking at the cost. I've not even begun to discuss benefits. So if you look at our base case, you're probably about half as much of substantial savings. If you look at the reclamation, 1/3. If you look at the loss of herbicides, a doubling of costs. So these are pretty compelling. And what we would say then, and what we've said to in the report to the utilities that funded us, is there's convincing evidence. We don't have a question here that IVM is working to their advantage on an economic basis. The differences are way bigger than any error that we think we could have put in here. So that's how, for example, we use the 75% changes. We think that the differences are so substantial that we might be wrong on the actual number, but we think we're right in the big pictures. Way to think about that. So here's a key point, however. The IVM strategy required a cost premium on the initial application. So what I've been motivated by as a member of the Right-of-Way Stewardship Council is to try to overcome one of the barriers for adoption of the IVM accreditation standard and generally the adoption of IVM, and that is the perception that it comes at a cost premium. And I would say yes, there's a small cost premium initially, not very big, and it's the crossover point happens before the next treatment. So it's a one-time only cost premium, and after that, it's money in the bank, and the savings is very substantial. So what we're recommending is follow the references that you have. You have the NCA 300 Part 7. You have a best management practice, and you have the right-of-way stewardship accreditation requirements document, which is IVM on steroids. It codifies IVM in excruciating detail. Use them, because you will save money. And there's more to that story. We were constrained, I think rightly so, to only look at the cost. And as I said, having worked in the industry for quite some time, I know the cost of admission to even having ideas entertained is to demonstrate what is the cost impact. And here we now can say to a decision maker, you will not pay a premium. You may have a premium initially for one rotation, but after that, the savings will be substantial and continuous. What's obvious is, what about the benefits, right? So we have a study here now that tells the bean counters it's the right thing to do, tells the regulators this is a prudent thing. This is a cost-based thing. You're not going to increase rates, for example. Benefits are the icing on the cake. Benefits is what we need to talk about next. The benefits that accrue to the utility, to the community, to the wildlife populations, they're all real. They're all out there. And what I hope we're able to do, and I'm seeking support right now for this, is to do a companion study there where we layer in the benefits on top of this. So we move, if you recall, there was those 3 approaches to economic analysis, where we move from cost efficiency or effectiveness. We move from least cost to cost effectiveness. And that's where we bring benefits in. We bring them in a dollar and cents manner to the extent we can, and we bring them in quantitatively where we can't, and we are able to put together the more complete story. And by the way, some of the benefits might be negative, right? We do have to address some of the disruptive nature of maintenance. But in this case, both methodologies, mowing probably is more disruptive, short term on wildlife populations or aesthetically. Those are potentially adverse benefits that needed to also be factored in. So that's where I'm going with this. I hope to be able to do that project. Chris and I, Noah and I, are speaking on Friday to see where we can go forward. And this report is available. I have a copy with me. It's a substantial document. This was a 50-minute presentation 4 weeks ago. I crammed a lot of stuff in it, and I've dropped a lot of the slides. There's a whole lot of detail in here. This is a difficult document to get, I will tell you. CEATI remains owner of the intellectual property, and they control access. Chris and I are working on ways to publish in peer-reviewed and trade publications versions of this so that it gets out there and is available to decision makers. And the final point is, if any of you are vegetation managers and are interested, this model now exists. And so you saw the prescriptions I showed you in those curves. We can write any prescription we want and put it in the model, and it'll tell us the economics, so you could actually take it to your own system or to a particular project to that level of detail. So with that, I am done, and we have time for questions. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Good morning, John. Thank you for being here.
Yep.
Your opening statement got me thinking that I think chemicals have been around for maybe 100 years.
Well, actually, sorry, I'll interrupt you, but where it starts is with the development of 2,4-D, and it's about 51 or 2 years old.
So even less than 100 years old, which is not even a blimp.
Right.
Not even a blimp on the radar of Mother Nature.
Yeah.
So, which gives me hope and faith that there are ways that we can integrate effectively with vegetation without the use of chemicals.
Yeah, I understand where you're going with that. So let me offer a phrase: chemically facilitated biological control. So here's what we're really doing with IVM. We are manipulating cover types to create competition, which is biological control. But the most efficient way to manipulate the cover types, at least now, and constrain the adverse impact on the tree species within the corridor, is selective applications. Now, you can talk about repeated mowing. As I showed you the curves, you can bring densities down, but you will not eliminate the incompatibles. If you can, on the other hand, embrace a strategy so here's an important point. Stan, I know you well enough to know where your bias might be. I said that we did not include the cost of initial clearing, the initial establishment. Now, it's possible when you establish a right-of-way that you may also establish a cover type, managing the rhizosphere, the soil, that will preclude or at least be effective in restricting invasion by incompatibles. So that is a way to do it, certainly.
All right, so my question is, you indicate that it's primarily based on an economic model.
Yes.
In any of the peer-reviewed in the articles, 50 to 100 that you reviewed, any of those articles, did they take cleanup contamination cost of prescriptions prescribed into consideration?
You need to define cleanup.
Well, the prior speaker, prior to you, indicated the polluting environment that we're in and that we're navigating through. There are contaminations with mowing as well as chemical prescriptions. In terms of leaking out in the soil. So are those costs taken into consideration to come to the conclusion that your report brings forward?
No. Let me say that what we looked at were the direct costs to the asset owner for these treatments. And so any impact of petroleum products or herbicides or whatever on the site is not factored into this. Right.
Thank you.
Yeah. Any other questions? Good. Thank you.